All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining the Council to Advance Hunting and Shooting Sports for our monthly webinar. Today's webinar is called Understanding the Public Who Traps, Insights into the Motives and Recruitment of Trappers. So we have two gentlemen with us today that are going to do a presentation. Tom Decker, he's a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Bryant White, he's with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and is the program manager of trapping policy and fur bearer research. These two have been working together for many years for AFWA's Sustainable Wildlife Use Committee, so they're very knowledgeable on the subject. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please ask them in the chat box off to the lower right-hand side. Ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll come back after the presentation and address those and answer anything you guys may have. Also, we'll be sending a quick survey out afterwards just to get your thoughts on what we're doing and making sure that we're providing useful content and information for you guys. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and he's going to get us started.
All right, well, thank you. Bryant and I are really glad to be here with you today. We're going to go over a bunch of information that we have, and I would just start by saying there isn't any magic solution that we have on this topic related to R3, but there is a great deal of information and resources available on the public who does this activity right now that's out there. So Bryant, go ahead and advance that slide. So we're going to show you a lot of human dimensions research studies that have been done in the past through the AFWA committee structure, and then a couple private universities. A lot of them most of them that we're going to talk about today were done by responsive management over the course of 3 of them in the last 2 years, and then some of them 15 or 16 years ago. So we have snapshots of the same information through time, some of them 2 or 3 different times. Most all the studies that we're talking about today were funded through wildlife restoration funds. And all but one of the studies were the funding source came, or the information we have came from that source. Go ahead, Bryant.
All right, and so relative to the surveys that we're going to talk about today, there are about 4 different things that Tom and I want to cover, kind of 4 sections of our presentation. First of all, we're going to talk about trappers themselves, give you a lot of statistics on trappers, some stats about how many there are, why they do what they do, what their interests are in the animals that they capture. We're also going to talk about the public, from some surveys that we've done of the public, what they think about trapping, why they approve of it, why they would disapprove of it, and some of the reasons for that. And then finally, we're going to talk about a survey that we've done of state agencies where we'll address trapper education. And then we'll go through some strategies perhaps for R3. And relative to these surveys, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that responsive management conducted most of these surveys for us through the grant. And I noticed that Mark Duda is on the call today, and I appreciate you being here, Mark. And so one of the studies that we've conducted over time, one of the surveys and reports that we've produced are just some surveys of trappers themselves, the types of equipment that they use, the types of animals that they want to capture. We started this back in 1992, again in 2005, and then most recently in 2015. And one of the things that we'll show you a little bit later is that all of this information is available on the AFWA website for you to go back and look at and dig through if you're interested in that. In 2015, when we did the study, responsive management conducted that through kind of a multimodal data collection process. We surveyed about 7,000 licensed trappers throughout the United States. 48 states participated in the survey. We didn't survey Hawaii because they don't have regulated trapping there, and then one of the states wasn't able to provide their contact information for those who held trapping licenses, and so we weren't able to reach out to that one state. But the evaluation in this report, if you look back at it, it's national, regional, and it's also broken down by state. So what I want to give you is some statistics on American trappers compared to hunters and anglers, talk about what species are most sought after, what types of traps that these trappers use to capture fur bearers, who actually participates in trapping and where. We'll also talk about trapper education and support for best management practices for trapping, and I'll talk about that program a little bit as we go through this presentation. And then toward the end, Tom is going to come back on and talk about the motivations for participating in trapping. So from our survey in 2015, there were 176,573 trapping licenses sold in the United States. We know that's not all of the trappers out there, because there are folks who trap on private land who don't actually have to buy a trapping license if they're trapping on their own property. So that's kind of a minimum number of trappers that are out there. You'll notice that in 1992 there were 150,000, 2004 142,000, and so to 2015 there was a pretty dramatic increase in the number of trapping licenses sold in the U.S. Not surprisingly, 98% of trappers are male. The average age is about 48 years old, and the average number of days that they spend in the field is about 36.7. One of the things that's a little bit disturbing when you look at the age of trappers overall, the vast majority of trappers are in that 35 years old plus category. So we're not necessarily recruiting a lot of new younger trappers into trapping, and so that's a bit of a concern and a good reason that we need to talk about some strategies for trying to recruit trappers. Comparing trappers to hunters and anglers, you'll notice that about 6% of the U.S. population actually hunts, and they spend about 21 days afield. 16% of the U.S. population considers themselves an angler or a fisher, and they angle for about 17 days a year. And so if you compare that to trapping, less than 1%, far less than 1% really of the folks in the U.S. actually holds a trapping license or participates in trapping. When you look at the regional demographics for where trappers are located in the United States, you notice that about half of them, maybe a little over half, are located in the Midwest. And so that's some important information for those in the Midwest. When you think about trapping, that's where the majority of them in the U.S. are. You'll notice that the Northeast and the West have about the same number, the South a few more than those other regions, and then Alaska has the fewest. However, based on the population of Alaska, the percentage of trappers there is actually pretty high. When you look at how often they actually participate in trapping, you'll remember that that was more than the days afield that hunters or anglers spend, and the reason is because trapping is much more labor intensive. When folks do set traps, those traps have to be tended almost every day. And so trappers typically don't go out and set a trap, check it the next day, and then remove it. Typically it's going to be out there for a number of days, and they're going to be out there checking that trap. And you'll notice that 24% trap 60 days or more, and so some folks are actually putting in a lot of days in the field trapping. We wanted to know what species that trappers considered important, and I suppose that would be very important for field days, for outreach and education purposes, to know in advance, what species that trappers were interested in the various regions. But across the country, the top 4 species were raccoon, coyote, muskrat, and beaver. But you'll also notice that red fox, bobcat, and mink were also pretty important as well. There's quite a bit of regional variation in what trappers considered their primary species, or the species that was most important to their trapping effort. In the West, bobcat; Midwest, raccoon; South, coyote; and then in the Northeast, red fox. That regional variation continues with Alaska. The species there are quite different than what's most important in the other regions of the U.S., and so you'll see marten, beaver, Canada lynx, wolverine, and wolf were the important species to those trappers. Those are good things to keep in mind, as I said, in terms of education and outreach. Also, the types of equipment that trappers use is quite varied. You'll notice that these percentages don't add up to 100% if you kind of go down through there and start looking at that. And so trappers were given the opportunity to name a couple of different types of traps that they considered most important, but the foothold trap was clearly the most important, followed by body grips, and then the dog-proof or foot-enclosing traps that are used primarily to capture raccoons. In terms of household income and the income from trapping, you'll notice that the majority of trappers are in that $40,000 plus for their gross income for the year. And then most trappers are averaging about $1,700 a year that they actually profit from trapping. However, you'll also notice that nearly 80% of them said that that income was not really all that important, but 20% did say that it kind of provided a safety net for their family. There's quite a bit of a churn rate when it comes to trapping license purchase trends. We asked folks how many times they had bought a license in the last 15 years or how many years they had trapped, and you'll notice that about 50% of them only trapped for 5 years out of the last 15. However, 21% are every year license buyers, and so there's kind of a deep association with those folks of the idea of just being a trapper. But that churn rate, I think, is pretty critical and important to note. Where do they trap? Most trappers, you'll see in the graph figure 11 on the left-hand side, about 64% said that they trap primarily on private land. But you'll notice in figure 12 over on the right-hand side that public land was really important in Alaska and fairly important in terms of the western states. And so there's some regional variation in terms of whether folks consider public or private land trapping most important to them. And just a few miscellaneous statistics that we also got out of that survey. We found that only about 40% of our trappers in the U.S. have taken trapper education. The Northeast is doing well, where almost 80% of their trappers have actually had trapper education. And there's some reasons for that we'll talk about a little bit later when I get into that part of the program. One of the things that I haven't said much about is our program for best management practices, trapper support for BMPs. That program actually started back in 1997, and what we're doing through that program is scientifically evaluating traps by an international standard and an international protocol that were developed by the International Organization for Standardization. And there are similar programs to what we're doing here in the U.S. and Canada, the European Union, Russia, and then also some work going on in Australia and New Zealand relative to that. But the goal of the BMP program is really to improve the welfare of animals that are captured in traps, also to sustain regulated trapping as a wildlife management technique, and then to try to educate trappers and agencies, scientists, the public about modern regulated trapping. In North America, through the BMP program, we've spent about $40 million, tested 450 trap types, and as a result of that, we've also developed an online trapper education program that's accessible to trappers anywhere around the world. And so support for that program is very high among the trapping community. 75% support that, 40% strongly support it, and only about 3% were opposed to this program at all. And then just one economic thing that we found out of this is that the sales of trapping supplies and equipment generates about $300 million annually just in the United States. We also know that the fur industry is about a $2.5 billion a year industry in the United States, and it's about a $30 billion a year industry worldwide. And so now I want to talk about some surveys that we've done of the general public. The primary information that I'll be using comes from a survey that, again, we conducted through Responsive Management in 2001 and again in 2016. This was a little bit smaller survey, wasn't actually nationwide. In the most recent one, we surveyed about 600 participants in the states of Wisconsin, Indiana, and Connecticut. There's also been some great work surveying the public done in Illinois over time, and so we'll be using information from a number of different studies as I kind of go through this section. And so next what I want to do is kind of show you a handful of slides that present the results from a variety of those research projects surrounding public attitudes on trapping. Much of this information was actually compiled and reviewed in development of the material that we present in a nationwide workshop that we call Trapping Matters. We've conducted that workshop in about 25 different states for about 5,000 agency staff since about 2001. But it's critical because the more we understand about our audiences and the public that we're addressing, the more effectively we can communicate with those folks. And so some of the research that I'm going to show you is foundational material that we used to develop a communication strategy back in the 1990s and that we continue to hone and refine today. And then some of these results are, again, fairly recent. And so we wanted to know from the public what were some of the reasons that they would approve of trapping, disapprove of trapping. And so you'll notice that the bar graph, the sort of purple color is, I think, folks who strongly approved, and then the bluish is those who approve. And so we get a kind of an overall approval rating that we have graphed out there for you. But you'll notice that there were 4 reasons that seemed to be pretty critical that would help people approve of trapping. 1, to know that trapping is regulated by agencies, that there are seasons, that there are restrictions on devices, there are laws and regulations about where traps can be set, and that there are quotas and bag limits. And so knowing that trapping is being scientifically managed by agencies was very important to people in getting their approval of it. As you might expect, another important factor was humaneness. Folks want to know that trapping is not cruel, and so one of the things through our BMP program, we have good science through which we've evaluated traps and trapping techniques, and so it's important for people to know that trapping is humane, and we have good science to demonstrate that that is true. Folks are also concerned about accidental captures, making sure that we can reduce those, or trying to make trapping more selective, to make sure that we're only capturing abundant species, that we can target those, that we're not capturing endangered species and those types of things. And so again, through our BMP program, we've been able to gather some very good information on that, and we have good science behind showing the fact that trapping can be selective. And then when it comes to lethal traps especially, folks wanted to know that animals are killed by those traps as quickly and painlessly as possible. And that's another area through our BMP program where we have done lots of testing. Again, that's based on an international standard, and so being able to demonstrate that is pretty critical to folks. Another thing that's critical is we know that 99% of the public or more does not trap, and so where do they get their information on trapping, and who's really a credible source for talking about that? And so you'll notice that the state fish and wildlife agencies were definitely the most authoritative voice when it comes to speaking about trapping. I think that's important for our agencies to know that they are the people that the public is going to listen to when they talk about trapping. It actually went up. The number of folks who actually felt that state agencies were the most authoritative voice from 2001 to 2016, and then you can see that some of the other sources of information out there, how they rated in terms of their credibility to talk about trapping. And I think probably one of the reasons that trappers themselves and maybe family are not necessarily real credible sources when it comes to most folks thinking about trapping is because the majority of folks out there don't know anyone who does trap. We asked folks if they approved of regulated trapping. And you'll notice that from 2001 to 2016, the number of folks that actually approve of it went up, and the number of those who disapproved went down. And I don't know if we can credit that to our outreach efforts, but there have been certainly some good outreach efforts going on in the U.S., and hopefully we're making a difference there. We asked folks if they thought that people should have the freedom to participate in regulated trapping if they wanted to do it. We know that most of the public doesn't trap, but the majority of the public feels like if somebody else wants to do that, they should have the freedom to do it. And so I think that's an important thing to know as well. One of the things that we also did is ask people kind of what were the reasons that they would approve or disapprove of trapping, and this is just from one state, Wisconsin, but the results from Indiana and Connecticut were actually pretty similar. But one of the things you'll notice in the amount of approval and disapproval for some of these reasons for trapping varies. As a result of that, we've been able to, through our communication strategies, to develop some key messages, because there are certainly weak messages that we can use and there are strong messages that we can use, and we want to use those strong messages when we're communicating with the public. And so one of the things you'll also notice from this then is that the reason that we're actually conducting regulated trapping as a part of wildlife management programs, that reason really matters a lot. And so making sure that we use the reasons that the public thinks are important definitely improves the strength of our messages and our ability to communicate with folks. And so when trapping is a part of a restoration program, you'll notice that about 90% of the public approves of it for that. And you can kind of look down the graph there and see what the reasons are that the public really approves and disapproves. And one of the things that you'll notice is down toward the bottom, the reasons that I guess have the least amount of approval are unfortunately some of the reasons that we've used to talk about trapping in the past, that trappers actually do that. Those aren't the strong messages to use. If we talk about making money or recreation or fur clothing, those aren't the strongest messages to use to talk about trapping with the public. We also surveyed the state agencies about their trapping regulations and policies and trapper education programs, and so what we're primarily going to talk about in this part of the program today is just trapper education primarily. I talked about our BMP program and its goal, and it's an important part of trapper education in the U.S. And so we asked the states if trapper education was offered. And you'll notice that about 70% of the states do have a trapper education program. In some states, the agency itself actually does the trapper education. In other states, it may be the State Trapper Association that conducts trapper education. But about 70% of the states have a program that they offer. And one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later is that the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies does have a national trapper education program that's online that any trapper in the U.S. Could take, or any trapper around the world really could go through that program online. Is trapper education mandatory for some trappers? Trapper education is mandatory in about 60% of the states. A lot of times that's just for first-time trappers only. Does your state recognize that AFWA North American Trapper Education Program for trapper certification? About half the states said that they recognize that program. And so we feel like that's a good thing. That program's only been in place now for about 10 years. And so we're making some headway with that as well. Does your state use the AFWA North American Trapper Education Program for trapper education? About almost 60% of the states actually use that program in some way as a part of their trapper education. Some states use it solely to certify their trappers. in addition to a field day. Others just use bits and pieces of it perhaps in their trapper education program. Our BMPs for trapping in the U.S., we wanted to know if states were actually using those as a part of their trapper education programs. That's one of the things that we developed these BMPs for, is for trappers themselves, and about 85% of the states that offer trapper education are using those in their education programs, and we feel like that's a very important thing and a big success for our BMP program. Another thing you'll notice is that BMPs have been used to expand the types of traps or methods that can be used in the various states. About 82% of the states have been able to approve of other devices that trappers can use as a result of our scientific research about traps. And then Tom is going to come back on now and talk about the reasons that trappers trap and their motivations, and then talk about some R3 strategies. And so Tom, I'll turn it back over to you, and when you want me to advance the slide, just let me know.
Okay, thanks, Bryant. So I'm going to now talk about what the trappers themselves said about why they trapped, and this comes from some of the same surveys that Bryant gave an overview on, and also some university surveys of 4,000 trappers from Maine to Virginia, and then revalidated recently with several hundred trappers in the Midwest in a co-op unit study. But basically looking at a multi-factor reason for trapping, these are the different reasons that trappers themselves, the public who traps, list as to why they do the activity. That it's an outdoor endeavor with important lifestyle implications. They enjoy the challenge, skill, and integrity of doing the activity. The utilization part is important for the meat, the pelts, part of a sustainable use of those wild animals. This element of wanting to be close to nature, for some a connection to the land, weaves in with this sustainable utilization. And some of these are very key themes that go all the way back into the early 80s when trappers are asked why you do this activity. There is an economic element, and the economy of it, depending on pelt prices, will make some trappers come in or go out of the activity, which can explain some of the churn rate. But as Bryant showed, we have more licensed trappers now than we used to, which is a good thing, but it's still very much a minority of Americans. They want access to the land for other things like hunting. There are some studies that show there's a barter element of trapping, that I will trap those nuisance beaver for you if you let me hunt on your property. Or if you do repair the muffler on my truck, I'll take care of those raccoons that are in your garden. Over 70% of the trappers nationally report that they, in the course of their normal trapping activities, do wildlife damage control for their neighbors. Basically, trappers, 97% of them trap in their own state, only 3% go to out of state to do it. So they're really a community-based activity, and a lot of them reach out to their neighbors. Or over 60% of the trappers had been approached by landowners to do wildlife damage management. And then they list a commitment to wildlife damage management. Now that's, or wildlife management in general. And for some, that's turning over their otter or mink carcasses so they can be analyzed for PCBs or heavy metals, or helping biologists know where bobcats cross major highways. There was this thread of they're helping in managing wildlife. Not that I'm inferring that they wake up every day and say, I'm going to help the Ohio DNR manage wildlife today, but it was an element of their psyche. Go ahead, Bryant. So we're all used to looking at people who are holding fish and smiling, or with a deer or a pheasant and their dog. For these people, this is their photo of success. And many people, when you look at that photo, what does that really mean? That's a lot of animals. What does that mean for commitment, and what did it take for a skill to actually catch? Those are red foxes, bobcats, raccoons, coyote. Go ahead, Bryant. So some of this research goes all the way back to Stephen Keller in the early 80s, all the way up to some of the research Mark Duda did for our survey just recently. But in general, sociologists tell us that they have a lifestyle orientation related to nature appreciation and wildlife management. And in factor analysis by a fellow named John Daigle, who did some of this work, thousands of trappers, he found these were the strongest reasons, and economic reasons were not as high in motivation. Although oftentimes we in our profession talk about, well, yeah, pelt prices are down this year, not a lot of people are trapping. There are studies where a portion of the people doing the activity report that this acts as a safety net or as a critical important. But as Bryant showed, for most trappers, the economic element is not important. And it's not necessarily a rural activity. It may, in some states like Massachusetts, 52% of the trappers live in urban and suburban areas. So they're conducting the activity within 5 to 15 miles of where they live, but they're living in urban and suburban areas. Next place, Bryant. So what does it mean to us or to the rest of the public, or even the public who doesn't do this activity, that we may want to, prompt their interest in participating? Many trappers hunt and fish, but as we see, not all fishermen and hunters are trappers. It's really technology driven. You need an inventory of traps and some transportation to do this activity, and so the gear up and the investment can be significant. And then, not unlike fishing and hunting, the skill level is really important. When you're a good fisherman and you know where to fish and what bait to use and what tackle to use, you can see the difference. But for the trapper to say, well, I'm going to get this animal to step on a little pan that's 1 inch by 1 inch to catch it out of its 10 square mile home range, that's a real knowledge and skill level that's hard to get without just direct mentoring, other than just trial and error and putting your time in. Go ahead, Bryant. So some of the findings from these studies recommend it's important for us in talking about these activities to understand their motives, and that it is really a lifestyle pursuit. And if we can capture the shared values of what that lifestyle pursuit is, either with other people who already utilize wildlife, or maybe segments of the public who have those shared values and just haven't been sort of awakened to this avocation, that can be opening the door. But an important challenge there facing our profession is that we need to develop a means for effectively expressing the full range of wildlife values to the public who doesn't understand the activity at all. And for some who, because they don't understand it, they oppose it, to make people just generally interested or think, oh, there's something I might want to take up. That's really a challenge, and that's partly why some of these communication workshops have been developed, because, as Brian indicated, we haven't always talked about it in the most effective way or with the strongest messages. And knowing a trapper is a key variable in either being exposed to trapping and finding an interest in it, or in just approval of trapping, regulated trapping by the public. Go ahead, Bryant. So just, you can hit the next element, Bryant. So these are the things that trappers have told us through different surveys about why they do it. And some of these things overlap with motives of hunters, some of anglers as well. And so, not that trapper is the gateway to community or activity to those activities, but they may be to this activity. And then other people, through some programs now, are entering into this activity directly without having taken up some of those other activities. Go ahead, Bryant. This is just a source of the different information and where the different studies were. You can move through that, Bryant. That's a resource. Those are resources that are available to you. Many of those studies are available here in these places on the AFL website, including the historical ones that we did 10 or 15 years ago. Responsive Management has some of these studies on their site as well. Most of these are also found there too. There's one or two may be missing, but most of them are there as well. They're available. Next slide, Bryant. So go ahead and populate this. So I want to just talk about what some of the challenges are related to this activity, from the activity in general. Some of it's the equipment themselves. There's a big difference in the equipment you use for water trapping versus land trapping, and we know that from our use surveys. So that's really variable, and then the knowledge that it will take to actually go afield and trap, it's a pretty high level of knowledge. Generally, if people are setting up a trapping line, they need transportation to do that. I mean, there are people who enter the activity by just trapping on 2 farms in their neighborhood. And they've got those 2 300-acre farms, and that's where they learn to mink trap or coyote trap or raccoon trap or whatever. But in general, there's this investment of equipment, often transportation. The commitment that you need is much stronger than hunting or angling, because the regulations, and that regulation survey Bryant referred to is really comprehensive. There's over 40 types of regulations when states begin to regulate this activity, which they all do. But when you set up a trap line, when you get that inventory and you get it all ready and you go out the first morning and you deploy it, and you set up that line, you're committed to be there every day. And it's not, well, the next day it snowed, I decided not to go, or, oh, I didn't feel good today. It's that commitment is there. And so you really need to block out a specific amount of time to put your inventory out, to catch your animals, and then the skill that it takes to actually work the animals up, whether you're going to eat them, pelt them out for fur or whatever. But that represents a significant commitment, thought process, and planning ahead, more so than angling or hunting, and not that you shouldn't plan out those trips too. Other challenges, if you look at this as an activity in trying to move it forward in recruitment, retention, or reactivation, it's delivered solely via hunter ed programs, state hunter ed programs. We know that 25 to 30% of the states and the federal agencies don't have those programs. Now, R3 is bigger than just hunter ed, with more divisions and parts of an organization moving it forward. But for this activity, it can often be key because the activity is so technical in nature. But if we're really trying to move this needle forward nationally, there's a significant number of states that don't have these programs. Other things that come into play, the cost of licenses for non-residents can be very high, $300 to $500, and that may explain why the non-resident element is really only about 3% of the public who traps. And then there are I'm just going to call them convoluted rules related to non-residents coming in and trapping. And you can only trap in our state if your state allows non-residents, but you can only trap species in our state that your state allows in your home state. But if your home state doesn't have fish or an otter just in your state, well, you don't even have the opportunity to trap fish or an otter in a given state. So those things have been in place for a long time, and we would question whether you really want to revisit them if you're trying to be supportive of a community of trappers, particularly when you have a whole bunch of states together like New England or other areas. Could your rules universally be more open to getting more people out there? And then with the instructors or mentors who participate in bringing new people on, many of them don't have exposure to the recreation adoption model. That's kind of limited, as we know. One of the better practices to actually expose people. There's better ways and there's other ways. So that's some of the challenges we think we face with the activity itself. Next slide, Bryant. And then what are we doing related to the activity? We've sat through presentations where when you talk to people about trapping or you ask somebody in a state agency about it, they talk about it as an activity of the past. Their references are, oh yeah, there's a lot of people that used to do it. I don't know, not many people do it anymore. It's kind of a good old days perspective. And there's other people that present this activity when they go out to talk about it. It's it's new, it's fresh, and it's different. It has the excitement of the internet. When you get on the internet, where are you going to go today? What search engine are you going to use? Where are you going to go to look at whatever you want to buy, read, plan a trip? And everything's an adventure. Well, when you set a trap line, you're using skills people had 400 years ago, and when you still go out, and you need to have those skills pretty well honed to be successful, and each day when you go out, it's different. And so trying to present the activity in that kind of positive fashion, you need to tell your own story, and you can't let your story be told by other people, particularly this activity. Some people don't support it at all. But how does your organization tell this story and tell this activity? How many press releases or social media blasts do you put out about this compared to youth turkey hunting or goose season? When trapping seasons are coming up, and what people do with beaver or muskrat, and how they're utilized. And do you have 4 or 5 of those blurbs a year that are supporting the activity in a social and cultural way? Even if your agency doesn't have a trapper education class, there's ways to actually tell the stories to either generate interest, but support the people that are doing it as a positive fashion. Did you guys just lose power, or is that just me?
We can still see it on there.
Just bear with me, my system went down. So then the other element is to retain, reactivate people, and that relates to the social part of it. There are states that have mentor programs, that they're running seminars. There are a lot of web resources out there. Some states have started to explore or actually loaner equipment, because there is startup elements, but to develop loaner packages for starting for a given species, with some selected people that they're going to have enter a mentor program. And what kind of things could your agency actually do, either informationally, workshop related, seminar related, or just equipment related, to kind of be a gateway to people to do this activity. The last item is related to messaging and overall communications. We know through our body of research that there's a lot of things the public, maybe the public who would actually do this activity, but the public who we need to be supportive of it, don't support in terms of the narrative and the description and the terms you use. And it's hard to get interest, or interest will be poor if a large section of the public doesn't understand the activity. Right, next slide. So the question we pose to people is, if you had 90 seconds to tell somebody why trapping is important, or why it would be of interest to them in trying it, what would you tell them? And that's one of the things we challenge many people in our profession at some of the Trapping Matters workshops out there. And there's a high variability about how they tell that story and what they would say, and what would get people interested, or even just support the activity, even if, well, they're not going to go, but they understand it's regulated, it doesn't endanger species, there's some management benefits, and it's part of some people's lifestyle. They cut firewood, they get maple syrup, they garden, and all these people trap as well. So think about that and how your agency or your organization talks about this activity. Next slide, Bryant. The last thing I would tell you, and Bryant mentioned them, is AFWA does have Trapping Matters workshops, which we've offered to over 5,000 professionals. And this is important not in the recruitment retention part, but it's just how do you begin to speak to the public on it. And it really expands into a one-day workshop some of the information that we talked about here, a lot more responsive management information in detail about how the public looks at these different activities, and then how to be an effective communicator just in general and with the media when you talk about this. And step one is making sure you're talking about it in an appropriate, positive fashion and telling the story in a supportive way. So with that, I think that's the end of our formal presentation, and we turn it back over to the council.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, guys, that was a great presentation, lots of good info. We don't have too much time for question and answers, but we'll get through as many as we can. We'll copy down the other questions, and we will post them along with the video of the webinar probably next week to the R3 community website. That's nationalr3plan.com. Most of you are on there already. But yeah, we'll just get started here. Dean's got a question. He says, trapper numbers have seem to be up over the years, but not many youth are getting involved. Is there adult onset trapping occurring?
There appears to be. That's what it is. Adults are older. They have access to transportation. They have money, disposable money for the inventory. And some populations of wildlife are higher, and there's this nuisance element, damage element that some of them are getting into. Not just solely for damage, but that's part of what brings about some of the interest. So yeah, that's what it appears to be, Dean, is an adult onset trapping.
Yeah, and one of the things I would add to that is that I think there's probably a lot of reactivation too, because there are folks who were trapping back in the 80s when fur prices were really high, and there were probably close to 1 million trappers in the United States back at that time, and I think, you know, back in at some point in time in their life and decided that it's an activity they want to pursue again.
We have a couple of questions kind of related to that. So one is, do the trapper numbers ebb and flow based on the anticipated fur prices pretty well? And do we think we might see an increase in the coming years at all with fur prices going up? Or are they kind of on the decline?
Well, they go up and down every year because they're a limited resource. There's only so much being available and harvested in a given year. And they will go up when the prices go up. But we find that right now there's this core element that they're going to go out there year in and year out regardless of the price. And we do know that when prices get really, really high for some species, the public that comes out and pursues those animals aren't always the best trappers or the most ethical trappers when prices get really, really high. But it can bring some people into it because some people, you know, it costs money to go, the transportation costs, the inventory costs. So, but there is an ebb and flow.
Okay, yeah. We have another question kind of pertaining to those costs. Do you guys have numbers on the average amount a trapper would pay for supplies, materials, you know, time, whatever? And then how does that compare to like what they would make? So I think you said on that slide you had some numbers with it was a little over $1,000 for fur sales. So is there a the supplies and materials are kind of just like the one-time cost, and after that it's not too much upkeep with the prices and stuff?
Bryant, do you remember what the data is there for bait and lure, traps, and other equipment? I just don't remember what that cost was off the top of my head, but it's in the survey. Do you remember, Bryant?
I don't remember exactly, Tom. I know that information is in the report on the survey. We did ask folks some questions about, you know, what their expenditures were, so we know what they spent on traps and bait and lure and snow machines, trucks, those kinds of things all went into factoring, you know, how much money they actually make after they've, you know, bought the supplies and equipment that they need. So I don't know that off the top of my head, but I know it is in the report.
Okay. And then I kind of merged a couple questions into one there, but we have another question here. Dean was looking for annual national trapper numbers and trends in the National Fur Bearer Harvest Database on the AFWA website. I couldn't find those numbers. Are those numbers available in that database? If not, what's the best source of data to determine national trapper numbers over time?
So the Fur Bearer Harvest Statistics database, we collect information annually from the states on their actual fur bearer harvests. And so that's really the only information that's in that database is how many animals were harvested in each state, and we add all that up. We don't ask the states annually how many trappers they had, and so really the only source for that information would be our reports, which we do, you know, every 10 or 12 years, or to go to the states every year and actually ask that information of them individually.
righty. Well, it looks like that there are no more questions. So we'll just wrap it up here. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and listening to our webinar here. We're going to have another one next month, probably mid-month. I think it's the 21st or so. Don't quote me on that, but somewhere in mid-month. And we just sent a survey out for you guys to take over this webinar, just so we can get some feedback from you guys, make sure we're on the right track, make sure we're getting good content and stuff. We will be posting this to the R3 community website. That's nationalr3plan.com, and it'll be posted next week, so you can be looking for that if you didn't catch the beginning or anything. So yeah, thanks Tom and Bryant again for presenting. It was great. And everybody else, check back next month and get on that National R3 Plan site and get in there, post away, share whatever resources you guys got, whatever you're working on right now. Just shoot them an update if you're looking for some insights or anything or some feedback. Use that website as a tool to communicate and hash out some of those ideas. So thanks again, everybody. We'll talk to you next month.